I was in Iraq in 1995 and had the opportunity to assassinate Saddam Hussein. He says, well, we don't have a phone number, we got this address in Lawndale, California, which I later found over was at an auto outlet. I call them up, they say, yeah, we'll send you an application. They send me this personal history statement, or I don't know what it was, like 50 pages long. You know, uncles, aunts, organizations you belong to, and on and on and on. I sent it off. I said, I'll never hear from these guys again. So about 2 months later, they said, can you come for an interview in San Francisco? I said, fine, I'll come down there. I was at the Hilton, downtown San Francisco. So it's sort of a crummy hotel now. But anyway, I walk in the lobby and call up, and the guy says, well, we're not ready yet. I said, so I sat in the lobby. And it was like, I sat there for like an hour, trying to imagine who in the lobby was watching me. I don't like James Bond's movies. I don't like guns. I have no idea. It's 21 years old. This guy calls me up and says, all right, the CIA is divided into two parts. There's one part are the analysts, and the other part are the operators. Right. Tell me about the analysts. He says, well, it's like, we'll give you a PhD. You get to study, continue your Mandarin. You read the newspapers, you read intelligence reports in China, and write your theories down. Every once in a while, I'll give you a sabbatical, and off you go. It's like getting a PhD, but actually getting paid. Where you're an academic. And I said, yeah, I'll take that job. He says, well, forget it, because you just have a BA. But you got to look at this other thing. You're going to go out at night. He talks about it. He says, yeah, fine. Do you ever say just fine to whatever people propose, like years in advance? Like bungee jumping, so I said fine. So they bring me to Washington, and they get their polygraph, and they want to know about drugs, and, did you ever have a DUI that wasn't, registered, and on and on and on and on. It was entering a parallel universe, seriously. And
what year was this?
75. It was a long time ago. So a guy calls me up and says, can you show up in Washington in 2 weeks and join a special class for the CIA? I look around my apartment in Berkeley. I was living with anarchists that owned them. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. I mean, how could they make this mistake of hiring me? They did, and then 21 years later, I resigned from the CIA, and the reason I resigned were two reasons. One is I was in Iraq in 1995 and had the opportunity to assassinate Saddam Hussein. We understood, the people on the ground, that messing with the confessional breakup Sunni-Shia Kurds in Iraq would only lead to a disaster. Iraq was a country that had been held together by Ottoman power and had borders that were held, drawn by the Ottomans for political reasons, not for confessional reasons or sectarian reasons. So we said, right, the problem in Iraq is Saddam Hussein and his two sons, Uday and Qusay. You get rid of them, you leave the Iraqis to work out democracy, rule of law at their own leisure. It's something we weren't going to get into, something to understand. I had an opportunity to kill Saddam in Ausha, and it's right below Tikrit. In fact, the government just took it back about 2 weeks ago. Kill him there, and I was in Iraq with what's called lethal finding. It was originally signed by Old Man Bush. It was renewed by President Clinton. So I had full authority to do this. I was missing a piece of paper called a memorandum of notification, which is to notify the president you're about ready to pull the trigger on somebody. And I said, that's just a piece of paper. Anyhow, the chief of staff of the military, Shali Kashvili, starts seeing all these paper coming across his desk saying the Iranians are moving platforms, they're going to invade Iraq. Kurds were on full alert, Saddam was on a GEAM alert, and the whole place looked like it was World War III. Tony Lake, the national security advisor, hadn't been informed of any of this. Shali Kashvili calls him up at 2 in the morning, wakes the national security advisor up and says, hey, do you guys have a plan to assassinate Saddam? And he says, no. He says, well, I'm going to start to have to move troops into the area to defend the troops I do have. So my team and I got off on the plane from Iraq and met by the FBI, badged for attempted murder and murder, which, you know, for somebody who grew up in Aspen, Colorado, and went to Berkeley, to have your office yellow taped by the FBI for murder is one of those thresholds that you cross and things are never the same. Very quickly, after that, I had an asset, it's called a source in the CIA, who told me Russian money was going into the campaign. I got sucked into the campaign thing, so between the murder charges and you get in the middle of Washington politics at its worst, I resigned from the CIA and never looked back since. And clearly being involved in an attempt on Saddam Hussein, an attempt on another man, doesn't make me an expert on killing anybody. So someone called me up one day and said, you should nonetheless, even though you weren't really an assassin to speak of, you should write a book about assassination. And I said, fine. And oddly enough, these things start with a title. And he said, call it The Perfect Kill. I'm not sure that that's a good title, but it stuck. The question then was how to write the book, because you could sit down and write 21, or describe 21 assassinations as an anthology, modern anthology, or you could do historical, Caesar, and go right down the line. But being very conscious of looking for, now that I'm a writer, looking for a narrative, I had to find a through line through this that told the story and do the history. So when I was in Beirut in the 80s, we had a man that we were after. We had a sealed arrest warrant for him. His name was Imad Mughniya, and he had perfected political murder. And we had permission to grab him, Central Intelligence Agency, and turn him over to the FBI. The guy was very elusive. He knew what he was doing. He'd grown up in the Civil War. From the age of 15, he had fought on the front lines, and he thought about murder and murdered people from the time he woke up in the morning and went to bed. His goal was to liberate Lebanon in the name of Iran from all foreign influence, whether it was Israeli, American, French, drive everybody out. He succeeded by narrowly channeling violence. He was somebody who avoided car bombs, blowing up schools, cutting off heads, and the people he killed, and as much they knew anything about it, they knew why he was after them. Whether it was the president of Lebanon, whether it was the Israeli commander in 1999. The Israelis got to the point where they had an enormous amount of respect for this man because of his limited violence. He, for instance, saw no point in shelling Haifa, for instance, which was well within his guns. But why kill Israeli civilians? He targeted individual officers. And as I said, in 1999, he killed this guy. Anyhow, what I do to this book is run the narrative through of tracking this guy. And this is probably the first book that I know of, at least, where nonfiction, where you have the writer trying to kill the protagonist of his book. And it's clearly not successful because the man wasn't assassinated until 2008. The CIA killed him in Damascus. When they killed him, they applied all the rules. He had a particular restaurant he liked, but it was next to a school. And the director of the CIA, Mike Hayden, said, "We can kill this guy, but we need the Gang of Four in Congress to approve it, which they did. We needed the president to approve it, and you can't kill anybody else. And oddly enough, they use what's called a shape charge, which takes an explosive and narrowly channels it like a rifle. And they did that. They killed the guy who was successful. So I had a beginning and end to this story, the murder of this guy, and my hunt for him up to a certain time. And then I took modern assassinations, and not to overwhelm the reader, but just enough to illustrate a rule. Whether it was Hitler or it was, any assassinations during the 17th, 18th century, simply to go through, because I wanted to go very light on history. I'm not a historian in all this history, as you're all well aware, but I just wanted to put it in terms of Mugnia's assassinations and where we failed. I get into drones, of course, but I didn't want to overdo it. I just simply made the point that they don't work generally. I mean, if you take the drone assassinations that we conducted in Pakistan, which were 2/3 were probably collateral, what did we really get out of this? I mean, we may have disrupted Al-Qaeda, but we have the Islamic State. And now we have the Islamic State in Yemen, which is strong because they have property. They broke into a prison today and got everybody out. They're a country now in Shabwa province in the Hadramaut. So we have these assassinations and stirring everybody up in Pakistan. Didn't end up in getting us anything. All right, you can take them. They're precise in the sense they were from telephone intercepts. I mean, I don't know how much history this is, but the first assassination we did for the Pakistanis is sort of to pay our rent. A guy they didn't like, which seemed a little bit cynical to me. And then you have the assassination of bin Laden, which it was an assassination. If anybody knows how the SEALs work, they could have taken him alive had they wanted it, but that's not the orders. It's not the way they operate. No one ever used the word assassination. So we didn't really get a whole lot out of assassinating bin Laden. And then what I can't resist doing in a book is telling personal stories, because I like to take people on the voyage I went. And one of the strange parts of my life is that my mother used to show up at very odd times in very odd places. When I was in the middle of the civil war in Tajikistan, she showed up. And it just knows it's true. And she arrives in Tajikistan, and we're sort of locked up in the embassy, which was sandbagging and shooting ports. We were protected by a Russian division. She says, "Do you think I'm going to sit in this damn embassy and while you work or whatever you're doing?" And she worked with the CIA. I said, here's a car and here's a translator who happened to be an Iranian rave dancer, but they speak Farsi and Finnish. So she took this woman, I didn't know where they were going to go, and they went up the Garm Valley in 1992, which everybody knows Central Asia then was Indian country. It was basically Al-Qaeda type people. And when she came back, she went all the way to the end and back, and when we went to dinner with my KGB liaison, and they just could not believe it. They thought my mother was a secret weapon. Well, she was, but they didn't know why. They didn't know the full dimensions of it. So I remember one time she came to Paris, and I wrote this in the book. And there was this woman. Her name was Dominique, is her true name, and she was sort of the real femme Nikita. And I've been trying to, find her, and my mother comes, and she calls up she lived in Los Angeles and Venice at the time, and said, "I'm coming to Paris, but I don't want to hang around the U.S. Embassy or Americans. I want to see," she knew French, I want to see the authentic France. So I went to my liaison contacts and said, "Can you guys find Dominique?" And the French were just sort of horrified because she'd been involved in 5 assassinations. First for the Palestinians in Beirut, and then for Action Direct, which was another group, and she was connected to Bader Meinhof. So you really don't want to go see her. So anyhow, but here's her phone number. She works in a bookstore. We don't have enough information to indict her, but you can call her up. So I called her up and said, "Hey, I know a friend of yours," and they said, "Let's, you want to get together." And she was just like she was not happy to hear from an American. I speak French with an American accent. And so I was going on, and I finally just spit it out. My mother's coming to town. Let's all get together for dinner. And it was such an odd statement to this woman. And she said yes. So my mother comes, and then she comes, and we go to the restaurant waiting for Dominique. And my mother, she's a big drinker. She starts ordering drinks and wine and everything. Dominique comes in, and she's a very skinny lady, very serious. And she sits down, and my mother offers a glass of wine. She says, I don't drink. And what really did it was when Dominique said she didn't smoke and didn't want my mother to smoke. And you just don't say that to my mother. So I thought there was going to be a shootout in this French restaurant. But anyhow, later I called Dominique because I had a professional interest in her because of her leftist contacts. And she said, oh, come see me. And I've got a conference to go to. You can come before we have coffee, or you can after. She said, no, why don't you come to the conference? I said, God, this is really interesting. You know, what kind of conference does a French assassin go to? So Paris traffic, I got there late, and I ran downstairs, and fortunately there was a little plaque that I looked at closely, and it was an EST conference. Does anybody know Warner R. here? So I escaped and never saw Dominique again. But I found these stories about that involved my mother, who was quite a character. I mean, I think was it Ehrlichman she assassinated in the hotel? Like she walked up to him, and he was sitting at a table. And said, oh, you're a great American hero, and my first wife is pregnant. I want your signature. And everybody sort of knew. They could hear the sarcasm in her voice. So anyhow, this book became a little bit Oedipal because along with the 21 historical assassinations, 21 examples of my trying to kill somebody, the protagonist of the book, 21 examples of his actually killing people and winning, you have my mother appears in almost 21 stories. So when I submitted this book to the publisher, I expected to get a call from the collection agency asking for their advance back. But so anyhow, this is a book on political theory, and the publisher insisted that I not give the end away, which is when you get to the end, you figure out assassination doesn't work. I mean, it's you either go to war or you don't go to war. You can talk about any sort of Hollywood ending to assassination that works, and it just doesn't. I mean, for all we know, the Nazis would have fought on in 44 if we killed them in July. I'm agnostic on that. It's not the way to go. I think we could talk about the hypothetical Stalin was maybe poisoned, killed. We don't know. Did it make any difference? Did it end the Cold War earlier? Probably not. One man just doesn't make a difference. I spent 21 chapters at that. And that, by the way, is my last book where I take personal stories. I talk about my very first book, See No Evil, which was made into Syriana, about interrelating personal stories, but frankly, I've run out of them. No, that's not to be. This book got me on an assassination list, which is a funny one. 6 months ago, I got a call from the FBI saying, we have to see you. And they have a little piece of paper, and they pull it out and says, there's a credible threat on your life. I said, by whom? Well, we don't know. Something to do with your book or something like that. And I said, what should I do? There's a CIA guy there, and the CIA goes, don't tell anybody. Just keep it to yourself. And the FBI guy calls me up, the agent calls me and says, you can tell anybody you want to stay alive. So anyhow, that is the arc of my career. And now I currently work for CNN and do commentary, which